So my book so far is titled Eliot's Study. I don't think that's going to be the name that I go with, but we'll see. Yeah, so that's my title so far. As for the summary, it's about Eliot. He's a 13-year-old boy from Paxton, Arizona, and he prides himself on knowing everything about his hometown and the citizens and their superstition inside the town and about the town. But the one thing that everyone, including Eliot, most passionately Eliot, can't stop investigating is the bell in the Frieder Church steeple. And he isn't allowed to investigate it just because his father, the pastor, has it off limits to everyone. But when Eliot takes a dare to go past the barrier of the church staircase and ring the bell, that Sunday and the first day of school start repeating themselves. And he and his new friends are tasked with finding out what they can about the bell's origins and who the mysterious notes he finds in the attic belong to, and if those authors are still alive. So yeah, there's a bunch of folktale stuff in here, lots of ghostly things going on, so a bit of a mystery horror thing. As for context, the chapter that I'm reading is right now the third chapter of my book, and it covers the midnight after a church meeting that Eliot's dad hosts at their home. It's kind of like a weekly meeting thing where people are allowed to come, but that's not important. It's also the last night of summer, and there's an annual fireworks show that's happening, and Eliot's been grounded from the infamous leftovers from the meeting, and he was looking forward to eating those since church this morning. But unfortunately, he disobeyed the rule of not watching scary movies with little kids around during a meeting that resurfaced during a family lunch conversation. So, yeah. He's already had a weird vision this morning and had to put up with the noisy townsfolk asking about the bell, and he's just trying to enjoy himself before school starts again. So, yeah, that is where we're at right now. There's fireworks going on tonight, and he's just trying to enjoy the last night before school starts. So, yeah. And my chapter is titled The Last Night of Summer. That is also a working title, so here we go. The whistles and crackled pops from outside burst with reflected color on the walls. People at my dad's church have always seen me as a well-behaved child. But these fireworks were a celebration of the last day of freedom that we junior high students could experience. It was all school books and pencils from here on in, so I planned on staying up late, leaving the house after curfew, just watching from the backyard, nothing too drastic, and maybe even bypass the fact that Dad took my leftover privileges. I scrambled out of my bed, knowing ahead of time that I wouldn't be in there for long. Who cares if tomorrow is the first day of school? Tonight was still the last day of summer, and all the high school teenagers were living it up across the neighborhood as they illegally shot up the fireworks that somehow became a tradition every year. I couldn't wait to join them as a freshman next year, but today my only job was being entertained and awestruck, even if I had better things to do, like try to sneak into the bell tower while my dad was distracted. I still haven't tried that yet, but it's been a plan in the works for months now. I stumbled down the stairs, trying to get past Bill. Already comfortable in his moccasin slippers and striped robe, he acted like an old man at the worst of times. I thought he should know this, so I gave him a light shove, which only resulted in him falling forward into the wall of the stairwell. The thud echoed through the house as he caught himself with his hands against the wall. I had already ran past him before I was yelled at. "Boys, no roughhousing or there'll be no fireworks tonight." Too late. Mom found us out. "Don't worry, Mom, I'll be the bigger man," Bill called, quietly making his way down the rest of the stairs. I ignored his betrayed sneer as I rounded the corner into the dimly lit kitchen. The windows shouted with colors against the silver fridge and cluttered stove. Blaring over the explosions was Cindy crying behind the couch in the connecting family room. She peeked her head above the armchair and squinted as I filled my arm with leftovers lining the kitchen counter, and then pointed right at me. Mom pretended to eye me when she noticed. At least it was Cindy and not Bill who ratted me out. I grinned and took a bite of the apple to make my mom feel better. She put her hands on her hips. Don't eat too much, Elliot. I'm warning you. Consider that a warning from your stomach as well. Bill gave me a dirty look, I said, and then crunched into the apple before I could be questioned. Mom rolled her eyes. Of course she was allowed to. Bill, express your feelings with words. Mom, before Bill finished, he lowered his voice and looked around the room to make sure Dad wasn't there, so he could fully give his opinion of the story. Luckily, Dad was there, the physically bigger man, donning a robe that still somehow intimidated despite a peaceful blue hue. Cindy, however, only started crying louder and covered her face with her pink blanket as if it were a large handkerchief. Dad picked her up from out of her hiding place and rocked her back and forth. You're okay, Cindy. You want to go back to bed? Cindy made a louder cry at this suggestion that I couldn't even decipher. What? He asked, scratching his ear. She says they'll be loud upstairs, too, Mom translated, and then took Cindy into her arms, bobbing her up and down. Shh, sweetie, it's okay. Calm down. Look at how pretty they are. She pretended to gasp at the window as Cindy buried her face in Mom's shoulder, tears pooling into her blanket. Mom sighed. I think you're just overtired. You played hard today, huh? Cindy responded by crying. My eyes caught a crowd gathering in our front yard out the window. I don't think our meeting is over, I remarked, as the neighbors gathered into our street. Like the nosy news reporters they would ask those same questions tonight as they did every year, especially the kids in my class. If answering their questions was all I was good for, I liked thinking they found my company enjoyable. It wasn't an ideal way to start friendships for the rest of the year, but it was something. One kid, Jeremy, could have been one of those people, but every time we tried to hang out, the mouse infestation comes to mind, as well as our mother's unspoken hatred. I threw open the back door, ignoring Mom's call, the ripple of explosions piercing my ears, exhilarating my brain that was, like Cindy's, admittedly tired. I spent the majority of the afternoon barricaded in my study in the attic, where I and only I am allowed to go. I would normally be preparing for the first day of school under my mom's orders, but I was nearing a breakthrough on the mouse incident at the O'Donohue's house, hoping that it wasn't just a coincidence, though still keeping an open mind to the less than tidy state that the O'Donohues managed to keep their house in. Shelves were decorated with both vases and a visible layer of dust. The bottoms of bagels were burnt, and the mold was something they didn't try hard enough to hide behind rolls of paper towels and a nice picture of a kitten with a bow on its ear. Mom brought me over to their house to have a play date with their son, Jeremy, and then politely and suddenly remembered a pressing errand that I was apparently needed for as well. I think it was a made-up doctor's appointment, but our sudden disappearance must have struck a nerve from Mrs. O'Donohue, since every one of her conversations with our family now is spoken under grinding teeth. I would have lied in my mom's situation as well, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought of this situation as a boring coincidence. My spirits sank even further when I realized how disappointing the fireworks actually were. I'm very confused now as to why Cindy was so scared. It was every 30 seconds that a new color would pop into the sky, some of them only giving off a puff of smoke. The show was nothing like what they did on TV during the 4th of July. I waited out the boring beginning for the more interesting assortments, sprinkled showers of gold with rings of green, and the giant red patterns with purple sparks, and the smallest fireworks crackling the loudest. The specks of smoke hovered against the stars, and the smell of burning air and campfires filled my lungs. If only we had a pool. Then it would be everything summer offered as a last hurrah of the season. Elliot? I heard from behind me. I turned around, and there stood Amy Blystone, clad in her winter coat, far too filled with that fluffy fabric on such a warm night. I wondered if her parents were around and if she was wearing that coat for their overprotective tactics. 2 figures between the lights followed behind her. One in an annoyingly neon pink sweater and the other hunched over in a hoodie. The third one I recognized right away as Jeremy, the kid from my class who only spoke to me every so often. For some reason, this felt more like a confrontation than a friendly approach, but that was probably because I hadn't spoken to other kids my age in a long time. Amy's tone of speaking, however, flowed briskly with a positive manner as she raised her eyebrows when she spoke and then lowered them when she finished speaking. I'm Amy Blystone? Lucy and Daryl's kid? We come every Sunday? Oh, I said. I remember trying to come up with other things to say, but oh was the only thing that came out. It's funny how our minds think of witty details to put into our speeches, and we just settle for the most basic response. I could have mentioned how I saw her parents this morning, or how they made me have to listen to another one of Bill's transcribed speeches from my dad. And this is Jeremy O'Donoghue. His brother knows your brother. And this is Charlene Gerald's, said the girl with glasses in the bright cardigan. It shone like the liquid they put in the globe bracelets, and I immediately remembered her from last year. She always wore a bright-colored shirt over her uniform after school, and sometimes before, as if she wanted to make a statement about her individuality. She was also the smartest girl in class, so apparently that wasn't a combination you saw every day, or at least according to the movies I've seen. The bell tower, I assume? I suddenly realized I blurted it out before I could stop myself. You're giving tours? Jeremy asked. I tried not to picture the fact that he came from a house with mold in it, and immediately thought of the quarrel our mothers shared. Does your family really own it? I mirrored his manner of sticking his hands in his pockets. Amy shooed him away. Don't ask about that. Then she went back to her polite posture, hands folded in front of her as if pleading for my forgiveness. It is very interesting, though. My family has been curious about it as well. Is there anything you don't mind telling us? Jeremy threw up his hands. You just said. I want to hear it, too. Are there really ghosts? Charlene asked, poking at her glasses. The conversation from lunch rang out in my mind, and a giddiness seeped into my chest. Do you really want to know? I asked, trying to sound mysterious. Yeah, said Charlene, as if that wasn't already obvious. Why do you think we're talking to you? I almost laughed, thinking that Charlene, at last, had become self-aware of her significance in my role at school. Nevertheless, the bell was one of the behemoths of my theories of Paxton, and I was going to put on a show for them. They would leave sniffing the pages of census records and clawing at the door to the bell tower, which I was sure was locked by now. Then, of course, being that there was no script in sight, I was left speechless. There was nothing I could tell them about the bell except the history they already knew. Their eyes that glimmered with tiny galaxies from the fireworks would soon close in dejection. Pressure built up from their impatience, and I took my hands out of my pockets, suddenly aware that my nails were bitten. The bell is an heirloom that's been passed down, and my dad doesn't do anything to clean or get rid of it. I collected my composure, knowing that I was mentioning details that didn't align. Now they wouldn't understand what I was saying. Bubbles of saliva inconveniently stuck to my throat, as I almost choked out the next few words. Not since someone was found dead, I finally concluded. Jeremy nodded. We know the story already. But what about the poet that cursed the town? Right, his family was superstitious. Do you know where he's buried? I asked, changing the subject back to the dead man. Right outside the church, said Amy, hugging herself in her coats of material that could easily be heard over the fireworks. Everyone who lives here knows that. But do you know why he's buried there? Why? Jeremy asked, obviously more interested than the rest of the group. I sat in the split second of silence until another firework burst like a makeshift crackle of the campfire. I imagined the colors illuminating my figure as the orator of this tale. Because he was unidentified. My confidence was long gone by now. What about the poet who wrote about the bell? Charlene repeated. The one that probably knows what they're talking about. I'm not sure, I said, receiving the harsh criticism. If I had my notes with me, they would see that I did in fact know what I was talking about. I think she's dead, so we don't have to worry about her anymore. Aw, come on, Jeremy groaned. One by one they left with disinterest, and I stood there in my backyard, my mission to enjoy a fireworks show completely ruined. Amy, however, stayed exactly where she was. Can I use your bathroom? I folded my arms. We don't have any other heirlooms in the house, if that's what you're wondering. Of course, I didn't think she had the nerve to steal something from our house, but considering that nervous look on her face, I was skeptical. She seemed so self-assured a minute ago, but just as suddenly she turned and walked away. Fine, you can use our bathroom, I called. With that, she ran inside, and I was alone again. That was when my mom called, Everyone come in, we have leftovers. This night couldn't get any worse, could it? Excuse me, young man, almost a whisper of a voice came from behind me. I was surprised that I even heard it, and even more surprised when I turned to find a tall adult towering over me, and I felt even smaller than before. She was dressed in a gray overcoat and hid the wrinkles on her face under a green scarf. She opened a journal in her hand and checked something off the page. Playing games? I nodded, my neck completely unaware of why it nodded. Yeah, I finally said. Excuse me. I broke through her barrier that smelled of smoke and iron, a combination I wasn't expecting. As both luck and misfortune would have it, I ran into my dad once again. He pointed a finger at me, but still wore a grin that exploded with fireworks. Remember, no leftovers for you, but tomorrow, if they're not all gone. He did a double take when he looked up and behind me. I followed his gaze, and the same old woman was only a few feet away. Leave, please, was the only thing my dad said to her. She was still for a moment, while he stood his ground. Now, I won't ask again. His face held that same worried look he wore during his sermon this morning, eyebrows scrunched together and pursed lips. I could hardly remember which part now, but then the woman left, and I felt a strange relief after her leaving us. Who was that? I asked. No one, he replied. Go to bed at a decent time tonight. I will. I thought of saying something like, I'm sorry for before, but the words never came out. Instead of going to bed like I was told, I took to the attic once more and decided to jot down my findings for the night. Who was that old woman who spoke to me? What did my dad have against her? Did it all have something to do with the bell? The roar of conversation carried on and quieted as I ascended the ladder to the attic I endearingly called a study, a place where I could be alone with my theories and take them into whichever direction I wanted, within reason. Journals stacked on top of each other overflowed on my makeshift desk that was constructed with love out of sturdy storage boxes and was sometimes home to spiders in their meals. The circular window at the back of the wall sent the same ethereal rays of color down on my leaflets and scribbles. These journals carried the secrets and happenings of the people of Paxton, and I had a profile of every citizen I knew, unless their stories proved to be uninteresting. Maybe after I solve the case of the bell, I'll move on to more miscellaneous tasks. But the bell is my life's work, ever since I started investigating the story 5 years ago, which would have made me 8 years old at the time I started, and I dread to look back on that embarrassing work. It's been a rocky career, especially being so young, but I think I know what I'm talking about, and I have no one to prove me wrong, even if this town is just as superstitious as I am. Of course, Charlene Geralds thought she could prove me wrong. Jeremy thinks I'm just a tour guide. Little do they know that I could be a scholar when I grow up. On top of all my research was a note that I didn't recognize, one that didn't measure the rectangular shape of my journals. It was a square piece of yellowing paper that felt like old tree bark in my hands. If Bill was in my study, I intended to confront him about it immediately. But the message written was unlike anything anyone I knew would say. As I read the short passage over and over, trying to decipher it with a tired mind, the conversation downstairs started turning into laughter. No, not laughter. Coughing. Everyone was coughing, violently. With what my ears could understand, it certainly sounded like coughing, but there was no telling why they were coughing. I put my ear to the wooden boards, the choking cackles spreading like a terrible virus of fear, which snapped into frigid adrenaline. Then the sound stopped altogether, leaving me to rise from the floor and stare at the boxes I had stared at so many times, but never under the influence of such an odd phenomenon. There was no way I was experiencing a coincidence tonight. Perhaps Mom was right and I was overtired. I waited for something, one of my dad's really loud sneezes or Cindy's random instances of laughter, or for that last guest to leave, with the door slamming behind them. But I heard nothing. For an entire minute, nothing. Childish concern that I wish I had the maturity not to listen to begged me to find out what happened downstairs. So I took the note with me and followed the sound of silence, the smell of fresh leftovers welcoming me downstairs. Even the fireworks had stopped, as I checked over the banister, peeking like a child spying on all the grown-ups having their meeting. But all the grown-ups, even some of the town children, were sprawled and still on the floor. Even from far away, I could see all of it, like the paintings you see on cathedral ceilings of a recent battle scene, blood trickling from their mouths and spreading like veins into their eyes and clothes. I immediately sank against the wall, almost tripping down the stairs. my brain urging me to ask the same question: where did everyone go? Elliot? My mom's voice. I turned with a gasp that refocused my senses somewhat. The conversation lull returned. I thought I saw my mom just a minute ago with blood on her face, but she stood at the bottom of the stairs, a towel over her shoulder and a sponge soaked in suds. Elliot, I thought you grew out of your spy games, she remarked, as she took a handful of snowy bubbles and stuck them to her chin. I don't remember why I nodded, but I did, unable to register whatever joke she was trying to convey, as I had just seen foam oozing from bloody maws to clean carpet just a second ago. She wiped off her beard and then sent me to bed before Dad could find me. As I shut the door to my room, I read the note aloud, my voice unsettlingly calm. A drop of silence, a drop of rain. A drop of fire, I'm back again. So that was my chapter. Sorry it was a bit long. Oh, the sun came through the window. Nice. Well, the process for coming up with this chapter and this book overall was mostly because I was excited about Mike Flanagan's Midnight Mass, which was coming out really soon on Netflix at the beginning of the semester. So that religious aspect was something that I really looked forward to writing about. But the story started to head in small differentiating directions as I started to think of folk tales and how the history of the town can be more involved in the story. Most of that influence coming from inspiration of Emily Lloyd Jones's The Bone Houses. So, yeah. I decided to take Eliot's interest in sociological theories and history since it's something that I thought would add to his motivation, and it's something that I get excited about as well, especially ancestry. Very interesting. But in this chapter, I got a lot of inspiration from my childhood on what it's like to have leftovers after a church meeting where my siblings and I would wait upstairs with a movie and until we were called down for dessert. So I can attest to that, and also attest to subpar conversation skills when coming up with awkward conversations for Elliot and his friends to have. On top of that, Elliot is living out a childhood dream of mine to have a study of his own in an attic with journals and theories. Those were most of the ideas I started out with after outlining and re-outlining my ideas, as well as giving myself freedom to write stories outside of the main story, like poems and riddles for other characters, and then my novel finally started to take some more shape. So right now, if it doesn't change again, it's about a young boy who wants to find out the mysteries of a bell he isn't allowed to look at, or even talk about with his family, and where those discoveries lead him. So most of my creativity for this novel really decided to show itself during the end of the semester, which is stressful but also fulfilling nonetheless. So, yeah, that was my process for coming up with this chapter, and I hope that you enjoyed.